In the early years of World War II, the Red Army suffered devastating losses. However, relentless tenacity and an impressive capacity for recovery marked the beginning of a series of large-scale offensives against the German forces and their allies on the Eastern Front. This military resurgence became evident after the brutal Battle of Stalingrad, a confrontation that not only inflicted a catastrophic defeat on the German forces, but also became a decisive turning point in the war. It was here that Red Army troops began to see their enemies retreating. Following the victory at Stalingrad, Soviet forces launched a series of strategic offensives aimed at expelling the Germans from occupied territories and advancing towards the heart of Central Europe. The liberation of Ukraine was a crucial stage in this campaign. Ukraine, with its vast strategic territory and rich resources, became the setting for some of the fiercest and most decisive battles of the conflict. Cities like Kiev, Kharkov, and Zhytomyr witnessed intense fighting between Soviet and German forces. With Ukraine secured, the Red Army directed its advance westward and southwestward across the vast Hungarian plain. On October 6, 1944, they launched Operation Debrecen, aimed at diverting German attention and resources from other fronts, such as the Western and Leningrad fronts in the north. The main objective was to launch a quick and surprise attack to secure the eastern region of Hungary and facilitate the advance towards Budapest. The operation involved several fronts of the Red Army, including the 2nd Ukrainian Front and the 4th Ukrainian Front. Under the command of Marshal Rodion Malinovsky, a considerable force of Soviet troops, including tanks, artillery, and air forces, was deployed to carry out the offensive. To defend Debrecen, the Germans committed several divisions, including Waffen-SS units. These forces were part of the defense structure of Germany's Army Group South and Hungary's Army Group South, which operated in the region as part of the Eastern Front. The 11th German Army Corps, one of the key units defending Debrecen, consisted of several infantry, armored and support divisions tasked with securing the region and protecting the flanks of the Soviet advance. Among the Waffen-SS divisions in Debrecen were the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte SS, the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, and the 3rd SS Panzer Division Totenkopf. These divisions, composed of well-trained volunteers and considered elite units, had participated in numerous battles on the Eastern Front and were feared for their ferocity and effectiveness in combat. On the vast plains of eastern Hungary, Soviet troops faced heavy artillery and fortified enemy positions, using the topography to their defensive advantage. Hand-to-hand combat was common, with soldiers fighting tenaciously for every meter of ground gained. Fighting in open terrain also left Soviet troops vulnerable to artillery fire and air attacks, increasing the danger and intensity of the battle. In urban areas, such as Debrecen, the battle turned into a ruthless street fight. The narrow streets and fortified buildings provided Axis troops with numerous ambush points and strong defensive positions. Soviet soldiers had to advance slowly, house by house, facing tenacious resistance at every corner. During the fighting in Debrecen, the Germans launched a series of local counterattacks in a desperate attempt to contain the Soviet advance and restore their defensive lines in eastern Hungary. These counterattacks, while demonstrating the Germans' determination to resist, did not significantly reverse the course of the battle or stop the Soviet advance. One of the most significant counterattacks occurred after Soviet forces massively crossed the Tisza River on October 7th. Faced with this threat, the Germans mobilized the 3rd Panzer Corps to plug the breach and launched a counterattack to try to drive the Soviets out of the area. Although they initially managed to force the Soviet forces to withdraw from the Tisza, the German counterattacks failed to maintain their gains in the long run, and they soon found themselves retreating again in the face of the enemy advance. Another significant counterattack occurred between October 7th and 15th, when 5 German panzer divisions launched an attack against the Soviet forces that had penetrated Hungarian territory. These counterattacks attempted to prevent Soviet forces from isolating German and Hungarian units, but despite tenacious resistance, the German defensive lines weakened and they were forced to retreat. However, despite their initial resistance and the numerous counterattacks launched by German forces, the Red Army eventually broke through the German and Hungarian defenses, capturing the city of Debrecen on October 20, 1944, consolidating their position in eastern Hungary, and paving the way to advance toward Budapest. Thunder over the Danube, the final assault on Budapest. After the capture of Debrecen, Budapest emerged as the next crucial objective for Soviet forces in their advance through Hungary. Aware of the strategic importance of the Hungarian capital, both for the Hungarians and the Germans, considerable efforts were made to fortify the city and prepare for a prolonged siege. The German forces, along with their Hungarian allies, embarked on an intense fortification campaign around Budapest. Barricades were erected, existing defenses were reinforced, and defensive positions were prepared at key strategic points throughout the city. Additionally, extra combat units were mobilized, preparing for a fierce resistance in the face of the imminent Soviet assault. Axis forces committed numerous elements of the German army, which formed the backbone of the German defense in the city. These forces included several infantry divisions, responsible for defending static and urban positions, as well as panzer divisions, highly mobile and equipped with tanks, meant to launch quick counterattacks and counter-enemy advances. In addition, elite units of the 9th SS Mountain Corps were among the forces deployed to defend Budapest, commanding 4 combat divisions: the 13th Panzer Division, the 60th Panzer Grenadier Division, Feldherrnhalle, the 8th SS Cavalry Division, Florian Geyer, and the 22nd SS Volunteer Cavalry Division, Maria Theresa. All of these divisions had been involved in the intense recent fighting around Debrecen. Among them, the divisions had only about 60 tanks. Despite everything, these highly trained and fiercely determined divisions fought valiantly in the urban and defensive battles of Budapest, facing an overwhelming enemy in both numbers and resources. The Luftwaffe deployed a variety of resources in Budapest to control the airspace and provide close air support for ground operations. This included anti-aircraft guns strategically distributed around the city, ranging from light to heavy guns, operated by highly trained personnel. These guns were ready to face any enemy air attack and protect the city's critical points. As for aircraft, the Luftwaffe had fighters and bombers equipped with heavy weaponry, as well as reconnaissance planes to gather information about enemy fortifications and strategic areas. These resources played a crucial role in the war effort in Budapest, providing air defense and offensive capabilities against enemy forces. The Kriegsmarine also made its presence felt during the defense of Budapest. Although the Kriegsmarine was primarily known for its operations at sea, its participation in the river theatre proved crucial in keeping supply lines open and ensuring vital communication between Budapest and the German forces deployed in the area. The Danube River, one of the main waterways in Central Europe, played a fundamental role in transporting supplies and troops to and from Budapest. The Kriegsmarine deployed coastal defense units along the banks of the Danube and other nearby waterways to protect the shipping lanes from enemy attacks and ensure the safe passage of convoys and supply vessels. In addition to coastal defense, the Kriegsmarine also provided personnel and resources for riverine operations, including river patrols, troop and supply transportation, and logistical support on the Danube and its tributaries. These operations were vital to keeping the German forces in Budapest supplied. For their part, Hungary made a significant effort to mobilize forces to defend Budapest, despite the difficult situation. The Hungarian army, though mobilized in large numbers, was poorly equipped and had suffered previous defeats on the Eastern Front. Morale and confidence in the Hungarian government, especially after years of alignment with Germany, were low, which affected the troops' effectiveness. To reinforce the defense, volunteers were called upon and paramilitary units, such as the Homeland Guard, were organized to support the regular army. However, these forces lacked the training and resources needed to face such a massive offensive as the one approaching. The situation was further aggravated by the constant pressure exerted by the Soviet advance and the deterioration of communications and logistics. The strategic importance of Budapest as Hungary's capital and as a major communication and transportation hub did not go unnoticed by German and Hungarian military strategists. The city was centrally located within Hungarian territory, making it a point of interest for both the defenders and the attackers. Furthermore, Budapest had significant symbolic and political importance. Its capture would represent a devastating blow to the Hungarian regime allied with the Germans and would further weaken the Axis position in Central Europe. On the other hand, keeping the city in Axis hands was crucial to preserving any hope of stability in Hungary and maintaining a key defense line on the Eastern Front. The roar of the siege. The first battles in Budapest. On October 29, 1944, Soviet troops belonging to Rodion Malinovsky's Second Ukrainian Front launched their offensive against Budapest. More than 1 million men, divided into 2 operational groups, advanced to isolate the city from the rest of the Axis forces. The strategic plan was clear: encircle Budapest and eliminate any possibility of reinforcements or supplies for the troops trapped inside the city. The intensity of the bombardment and the coordination between Soviet units were key aspects of this offensive, aiming to undermine the enemy's morale and resistance capacity from the outset. The first weeks of fighting were intense and chaotic. The Red Army, accompanied by elements of the 53rd Army and the 7th Guards Army, quickly advanced toward the suburbs of Budapest, encountering fierce resistance from the defenders, composed of German army units, the Waffen-SS, and the Hungarian Army, who had already entrenched themselves to defend the city. Leading the defenses was SS General Karl Pfeffer-Wildenbruch, commander of the 9th Waffen-SS Mountain Corps. The German elite troops, being well-trained and equipped Axis units, employed aggressive tactics to counter the Soviet advance during the early battles in Budapest, fighting in street combat, where the urban terrain favored their mobile and lethal combat style. Additionally, they managed to organize the defense in critical areas of the city, establishing fortified positions and deploying heavy weaponry to repel enemy attacks. Their training in assault tactics allowed them to launch bold counterattacks, to keep the enemy at bay and reclaim lost ground. But despite their bravery and determination, the SS forces suffered significant losses due to the ferocious Soviet attacks and constant bombardments. This situation would result in a decrease in the combat capability of the divisions as the siege of Budapest progressed. On November 7, 1944, Soviet and Romanian troops managed to penetrate the eastern suburbs of Budapest, dangerously approaching the old city center just 20 kilometers away. However, German and Hungarian resistance continued, even though the Axis forces were clearly outnumbered and outmatched logistically. The tenacity of the defenders became a hallmark of the battle, prolonging the fight and adding complexity to the Soviet advances. After a brief pause in operations, the Red Army resumed its offensive on December 19th, further intensifying the fighting and suffering in Budapest. On December 26th, Soviet troops succeeded in completing the encirclement of the city by capturing a road that connected Budapest with Vienna, completely isolating Budapest from the rest of the Axis-controlled territory. As a result of the Soviet encirclement, nearly 33,000 German soldiers, 37,000 Hungarians, and more than 800,000 civilians were trapped within the city. As the fighting intensified, the civilian population suffered enormously from the consequences of the siege. The Hungarian leader, Ferenc Szálasi, supported by the Nazis, had already fled the city in December, leaving his citizens at the mercy of the Soviet advance and the harsh conditions of the siege. On December 26, 1944, Budapest was declared a fortress city, a designation that meant the city had to be defended to the last man, with no authorization for retreat or surrender by the Axis forces defending it. As the siege dragged on, and with humanitarian and military conditions worsening for the Axis forces and the trapped civilian population, the need to negotiate a surrender emerged. During the night of December 28th, the Ukrainian fronts sought to establish contact with the besieged Germans to begin capitulation talks. However, hopes for a peaceful resolution were quickly dashed when the negotiation attempts turned into deadly clashes. The Soviet emissaries, who had arrived with the promise of humane conditions and a non-violent surrender, were met with a hostile response from the Axis troops. Heroes and challenges. The first rescue attempts in Budapest. On December 24, 1944, before the final closure of the siege, Adolf Hitler ordered the 4th SS Panzer Corps and the 96th and 711th Infantry Divisions, with about 200 tanks and 60,000 men, to mobilize to Hungary under the command of SS Obergruppenführer Otto Giele, who had been decorated for breaking the siege at Cherkasy. Himmler sent a telegram to Giele, telling him that Hitler had chosen him because of his extensive experience with being surrounded and because his Panzer Corps had proven to be the best on the Eastern Front. The German Army Group South Command and Guderian disagreed on the use of the regrouped units, but there was general consensus that Budapest should be abandoned, and an escape should be approved as soon as possible. This suggestion was made to Hitler almost daily, but in vain. The choice between two different relief routes was difficult. An offensive towards Székesfehérvár in the south, codenamed Paula, which considered a greater distance, would have required more fuel and delayed the arrival of troops by 5 days. The alternative, an offensive to the north, codenamed Konrad, involved a shorter distance and offered the element of surprise, but entailed greater risks due to the terrain. Despite Guderian preferring Operation Paula, his representative, Generaloberst Walter Wenck, was persuaded by the reasoning of the German Army Group South, and the High Command ultimately opted for the faster Operation Konrad. The regrouped units began moving to Hungary on December 28th, hoping the Soviets had not yet established solid defensive positions. The German command issued orders to attack before the arrival of all German troops was complete. At that time, only 32% of the 5th SS Panzer Division Viking, 66% of the 3rd SS Panzer Division Totenkopf, and 43% of the 96th Infantry Division were in place, with no sign of the 711th Infantry Division. Guderian arrived at Tata on January 7th to oversee the operation. Károly Beregfy, Szalasi's defense minister, offered the participation of Hungarian troops. However, his forces, the 1st Hussar Division, the 2nd Armoured Division, and the 23rd Reserve Division, were too depleted to be used. On the night of January 1st, 1945, the 4th SS Panzer Corps, now part of Armeegruppe Balk, with only half its forces having arrived in Komárom, launched Operation Konrad Brumad, launching a surprise attack in the Tata-Almas-Fuzito region. Meanwhile, the 96th Infantry Division, crossing the Danube from the north in assault boats, established 2 bridgeheads behind Soviet troops. The 2 battalions of the Hungarian SS Kampfgruppe Ney were deployed for the first time. Attached as anti-tank grenadiers to the SS Panzer Divisions Viking and Totenkopf, the attackers captured Gerexa Hill, but by January 6th, the Soviets halted their advance near Bitsk and Zsámbék. 2 topographical factors worked against the offensive. First, in the Gerexa and Pilis Hills, it was easy for the Soviets to establish barricades with anti-tank guns. Second, the narrow, long pocket that would have formed along the Danube could be broken by the Soviets without much effort. In these events, the Soviets were skilled in slowing the assault of the German tanks, ensuring that their reserves had enough room to maneuver. On January 2nd, the Soviet 18th Tank Corps joined the battle, followed on January 3rd by 3 more fast-moving units. In the Bitski region, the main target of the German offensive, the 5th Viking Division faced a heavy tank regiment, 4 assault gun regiments, 3 rifle divisions, a mechanized brigade, and 6 technical battalions, 2 to 3 times the strength of the Germans. The same occurred in other places along the breadth of the German attack, where on January 4th the 1st Guards Mechanized Corps also arrived from Adoni. Thus, no fewer than 5 Soviet mechanized, armored, or cavalry corps had aligned against the main German relief effort, blocking any advance toward Budapest. Only the northern group managed to capture Esztergom on January 6th and Pilis-Szent-Lélek on January 8th. German-Hungarian losses between January 1st and 7th amounted to around 3,500 men from the 4th SS Panzer Corps, including dead, wounded, and missing. Additionally, 39 armoured vehicles were lost, a significant blow given the few resources available at that point in the war. Meanwhile, Fyodor Tolbukin, commander of the 3rd Ukrainian Front, had also made preparations to prevent a German escape from Budapest. He had erected defensive lines with anti-tank guns facing both the relief forces and potential escapees. On January 3rd, he ordered the cessation of attacks against Buda to free up more forces. On January 6th, 7 divisions, approximately the same size as all the German and Hungarian forces in the capital, were positioned between Zsámbék and Tini. In the event of an escape, the fugitives would first have had to break through the encirclement ring around the city, and then, after a long march, face this formidable second defensive line. The chances of an organized escape in any direction other than north were therefore impossible, and an escape to the north could only have succeeded if the German relief attempts in the Pilis Hills had not been halted, as they ultimately were. Heinz Guderian, unaware of the real situation, planned to incorporate the defenders into the stalled offensive. In addition to holding the capital, they would launch an attack northwest to assist the relief units. The German Army Group Command, more realistically, recommended abandoning the eastern bridgehead on January 9th and breaking out to the northwest, or, failing that, breaking through the encirclement in small, independent combat units. However, this was rejected by Hitler. Konrad I had failed to achieve satisfactory results, and it was time to launch the second phase, Konrad II. As a continuation of German efforts to break the Soviet encirclement around Budapest, on January 7, 1945, Operation Konrad II was launched. It represented another desperate attempt to break the siege surrounding Budapest and provide much-needed relief for the troops trapped inside the city. After the failure of the first operation, Totenkopf and Viking launched an assault aimed at reaching the city center. The attack, named Operation Konrad II, was launched on January 7th from south of Esztergom. It reached the northern suburbs of Budapest. On January 12th, the motorized infantry of the Viking division saw the skyline of the Hungarian capital. However, Gill's corps was too spread out and vulnerable, so they were ordered to retreat. The 4th SS Panzer Corps, under the command of General Otto Wöhler, launched the attack from Esztergom, located north of Budapest, determined to reach and capture the city's airport. Hoping to open a vital corridor for the air transport of supplies and reinforcements, Axis troops faced difficult terrain and fierce resistance from the Soviet forces defending the area. The advance of the 4th SS Panzer Corps was hampered by a series of challenges and setbacks. As they approached the airport, they encountered increasingly strong opposition from Soviet forces who were determined to maintain their control over this key strategic position. The fighting was intense and brutal, with close-quarters combat and constant exchanges of fire that took a heavy toll on both sides. Despite the determined efforts of the Axis troops, Operation Konrad II was ultimately halted near Budapest airport. The Soviet forces, well entrenched and determined to defend their position, withstood the attacks of the 4th SS Panzer Corps with tenacity and ferocity, frustrating their attempts to capture the airport and secure a vital supply corridor for the city. Hell in the streets, the epic Battle of Budapest with the SS. In the heart of Budapest, as the siege dragged on, the anguish and suffering of the civilian population reached unimaginable levels. The streets, once full of life and activity, transformed into a heartbreaking scene of struggle and despair. Every building, every corner became a battlefield where citizens fought to survive. As the days passed, human losses multiplied at an alarming rate. Tens of thousands of people lost their lives, were wounded, or were forced to flee their homes due to the relentless violence of the fighting and the devastation caused by the war. The city's iconic buildings, once symbols of its grandeur, were reduced to piles of rubble, while hospitals, schools, and homes became smoldering ruins. The shortage of food, clean water, and adequate medical care added to the daily horrors faced by the civilian population, who found themselves trapped in an endless cycle of suffering. Each day was a struggle to find something to eat, to access clean water, or to receive medical treatment for wounds caused by the bombings and street fighting. Amid this brutal confrontation, desperation and desolation increasingly took hold of the besieged city. As the fighting intensified in the streets of Budapest, desperation and brutality reached unprecedented levels. The loss of the strategic Ferihegi airport on December 27, 1944, just before the siege began, heightened the urgency for supplies for the German troops. Until January 9, 1945, they were still able to use some of the main avenues and the area near Buda Castle as landing points for planes and gliders, despite the constant bombardment by Soviet artillery lurking nearby. Before the Danube completely froze over, some supplies managed to reach the city via barges, taking advantage of the protection provided by the darkness and dense fog enveloping the region. However, the food shortage became increasingly suffocating, forcing soldiers to desperately seek any available source of sustenance, even resorting to consuming their own horses, comrades in battle who now became scarce resources for survival. The extreme winter temperatures, freezing the streets and covering everything in a blanket of snow and ice, added another layer of suffering for both the German and Hungarian troops. Amid these adverse conditions, they fought bravely against the elements, in addition to facing the fierce advance of enemy forces. Every day was a battle not only against the enemy but also against nature, which seemed to ally itself against them. The Soviet troops, like their German adversaries in Stalingrad, found themselves trapped in a ruthless urban battle. They took advantage of the urban terrain, relying on snipers and sappers to advance and destabilize enemy defenses. By mid-January, the Sepal Island had fallen into Soviet hands, along with its military factories, which continued producing armaments even under enemy fire. Meanwhile, in Pest, the situation for the Axis forces became increasingly precarious, with the imminent risk of being divided by the Soviet advance. On January 17, 1945, Hitler relented and ordered the remaining troops to withdraw from Pest to try and defend Buda. The 5 bridges crossing the Danube were congested with traffic, making it difficult to evacuate troops and civilians. Finally, on January 18th, the German troops destroyed the bridges, including the famous Chain Bridge, despite protests from Hungarian officers. The last hope, the epic odyssey of Operation Konrad III in Budapest. As the last and most ambitious rescue attempt, German forces launched Operation Konrad III on January 18, 1945. During the fighting, the Soviet Third Ukrainian Front bore the brunt of the attack from the German Sixth Army. Leading the assault was the 4th SS Panzer Corps, which, alongside the 3rd Panzer Corps, had a complement of 376 operational panzers at the start of the offensive. The Soviet 4th Guards Army, with only 250 operational tanks, had poor intelligence that completely failed to detect the arrival of the 4th SS Panzer Corps in front of them. The intelligence sections of the 2nd and 3rd Ukrainian fronts mistakenly believed the SS were being deployed west of Hungary. With support from the German Air Force, the SS attack achieved complete surprise, overwhelming the Soviet 4th Guards Army in less than 2 days as the 3rd and 5th SS Panzer Divisions, well equipped with qualitatively superior Panther tanks compared to Soviet T-34s, quickly destroyed many Soviet tanks. The Soviet 18th Tank Corps and 130th Rifle Corps were encircled, and the SS tanks crushed a counterattack from the Soviet 7th Mechanized Corps. The Germans lacked infantry to quickly reduce the pockets, allowing many Soviet forces to escape. By the end of the first day, a 30-kilometer wide and 60-kilometer deep breach had been created in the Soviet front line, and SS tanks reached the Danube on January 19th, splitting the Soviet forces in Transdanubia in 2. By January 21st, the Germans had captured 400 square kilometers of territory, a feat comparable to the initial German advances during the Ardennes offensive on the Western Front in December 1944. Constantly attacked by the Luftwaffe, 40,000 Soviet troops and large amounts of military equipment were transported to the East Bank to prevent them from falling into German hands. The Hungarian city of Székesfehérvár, a key transit point for supplies and home to 40,000 inhabitants, was captured by the Axis on January 22nd after heavy fighting. By January 19th and early January 20th, there were no Soviet troops between the spearheads of the 4th SS Panzer Corps and the Axis garrison in Budapest. The 3rd Ukrainian Front transferred the 5th Cavalry Corps with 100 tanks, 360 artillery pieces, 3 anti-tank gun regiments, and 6 artillery regiments to block the gap. The 3rd SS Panzer Division Totenkopf advanced towards Soviet defenses and was 25 kilometers from the Budapest pocket on January 26th. The 1st Panzer Division broke through Soviet defensive lines near Val and established radio contact with the Budapest defenders. However, 6th Army Commander Hermann Balck ordered them to pull back, much to the indignation of Herbert Gill, the commander of the 4th SS Panzer Corps. The underlying reason for Balck's order was the lack of infantry in the corps, leading to long and vulnerable security lines. Thus, on January 27, 1945, the relief forces were unable to achieve their objective. Despite advancing 24 kilometers into Soviet lines and destroying the 135th Rifle Corps, the Budapest defenders requested permission to abandon the city and escape the encirclement, but Hitler refused. The rapid redeployment of more Red Army troops halted the German advance, pushing the depleted German forces back on January 28th. By the end of the month, the 5th SS Panzer Division Viking and the 3rd SS Panzer Division Totenkopf had suffered 8,000 casualties, including 200 officers. The 3rd Totenkopf Division and the 5th Viking Division were withdrawn westward, conducting a fighting retreat from Budapest to the area near Lake Balaton, where the 6th SS Panzer Army under Oberstgruppenführer Josef Dietrich was concentrating for the upcoming Operation Spring Awakening. The Battle of Buda, epicenter of struggle and valor. In contrast to Pest, which sits on flat terrain, Buda was built on elevated ground. This arrangement favored the defenders, who were able to position artillery and defensive structures above the attackers, significantly slowing the Soviet advance. The main fortification, known as Gellert Hill, was defended by Waffen-SS troops, who successfully repelled several Soviet assaults. Nearby, enemy forces engaged in fierce battles in the city cemetery, fighting among graves shattered by projectiles in a confrontation that lasted several days. On February 11, 1945, after 6 weeks of intense fighting, Gellert Hill finally fell. The Soviets launched a vigorous attack from 3 directions simultaneously. Enemy artillery dominated the entire city, shelling the few remaining Axis defenders who were concentrated in less than 2 square kilometers, suffering from malnutrition and disease. Despite the shortage of supplies, the Axis forces refused to capitulate and defended every street and house with determination. At this point, some captured Hungarian soldiers deserted and joined the Soviet side, forming what became known as the Buda Volunteer Regiment. After capturing the southern train station in a bloody 2-day battle, Soviet troops advanced toward a prominent hill in the heart of Buda, known as Castle Hill. It was the scene of fierce fighting between the last German defenders and the attacking forces. This elevation not only provided a strategic view of the city, but was also densely fortified by Axis forces, making it a formidable stronghold that the Soviet attackers had to conquer at any cost. The hill was protected by a network of trenches, bunkers and barricades that offered formidable defense against any assault. The Soviet assault on Castle Hill was preceded by intense artillery preparation and air bombings designed to weaken the Axis defenses and disorganize their troops. Once the ground assault began, Soviet soldiers faced fierce and relentless resistance from the Axis forces, who defended every position with unwavering determination. By February 10th, after fierce and violent fighting, Soviet Marines managed to secure a foothold on Castle Hill, nearly splitting it in 2 and significantly reducing the remaining garrison, thus consolidating their control over the hill and taking one step closer to victory in the Battle of Buda. Escape and surrender, the fall of Budapest and the decline of the SS. Amid the relentless siege of Budapest and under Hitler's prohibitive orders not to abandon the city, German commander Pfeffer-Wildenbruch faced a desperate situation. Supply deliveries via glider flights and parachute drops had ceased, leaving the trapped forces in a hopeless situation with no prospect of relief. Faced with the urgency of the situation, Pfeffer-Wildenbruch made a bold and unconventional decision. He opted to organize the evacuation of the remnants of his troops from Budapest. Surprisingly, he decided to include Hungarian General Ivan Hindi in this last-ditch effort to escape the besieged city. On the night of February 11th, around 28,000 German and Hungarian soldiers, accompanied by thousands of civilians, began a risky march northwest, away from the defenses of Castle Hill. Divided into 3 waves, they crossed snow and ice-covered terrain, dragging entire families with them in a grim and heartbreaking procession. The thick fog offered them a momentary veil of protection as they left the city, taking advantage of the element of surprise to confuse the Soviet troops, who were lying in wait near Celle-Calman-Terre to ambush them. The first wave managed to surprise the enemy soldiers and artillery, allowing many to escape to freedom. However, the second and third waves were not so lucky. Soviet forces, alerted by the movement, quickly surrounded the escape zone, unleashing a hell of fire and shrapnel that took a heavy toll on human lives. Despite the bravery and determination of the fugitives, thousands perished under the relentless enemy bombardment. Although between 5,000 and 10,000 people managed to reach the wooded hills northwest of Budapest and begin the arduous journey to safety in Vienna, only a handful of German and Hungarian soldiers broke through the enemy lines and reached friendly territory. Most of the fugitives, including Pfeffer-Wildenbruch and Hindi, did not escape their inevitable fate. Captured by Soviet troops, their brave attempt to flee the tragedy of Budapest ended in imprisonment and, in many cases, a tragic fate. On February 13, 1945, after weeks of tenacious resistance and heartbreaking confrontations, the last defenders of Budapest finally capitulated, with devastating military losses that left entire divisions practically annihilated. Among the affected German units were the 13th Panzer Division, the 60th Panzer Grenadier Division Feldherrnhalle, the 8th SS Cavalry Division Florian Geyer, and the 22nd SS Volunteer Cavalry Division Maria Theresa, along with the near-complete annihilation of the Hungarian I Corps and several infantry and armoured divisions. In contrast, Soviet forces also paid a significant price, with casualty estimates ranging from 100,000 to 160,000 soldiers. However, the figure of prisoners claimed by the Soviets, who asserted they had captured 110,000 German and Hungarian combatants, was a subject of controversy due to the inclusion of thousands of Hungarian civilians in the prisoner of war count. The devastation inflicted on Budapest was catastrophic, with more than 80% of its buildings reduced to ruins and all 7 bridges crossing the Danube destroyed, including historic structures like the Hungarian Parliament building and the castle. Additionally, thousands of ethnic Germans in Hungary were arrested and transported to the Soviet Union as forced laborers, and more than 500,000 Hungarians, including between 100,000 and 170,000 ethnic Germans, were deported to labor camps in inhumane conditions. The siege of Budapest marked the end of an era for the Germans on the southern front, further depleting the resources of the Wehrmacht and the Waffen-SS for the Soviets. It served as a dress rehearsal before the Battle of Berlin and paved the way for the Vienna offensive, which culminated in the fall of the city on April 13, 1945. After the siege of Budapest ended, an unimaginable human tragedy unfolded in the streets of the city. Around 38,000 civilians, caught in the whirlwind of war, lost their lives under harrowing conditions. Among them, approximately 13,000 died as a direct result of the war, while another 25,000 succumbed to starvation, disease, and other causes stemming from the hunger and despair that reigned in the besieged city. However, amid these overwhelming figures of suffering and loss, one particularly atrocious horror stands out: the mass executions perpetrated by the far-right nationalist Hungarian party, the Arrow Cross. It is estimated that around 15,000 people fell victim to these atrocities, marking one of the darkest and most sinister episodes in Budapest's history during World War II. Although the Soviet High Command issued strict directives to prevent the mistreatment of prisoners of war and civilians and took strong measures against those who disobeyed these orders, the end of hostilities did not bring the expected peace and calm. On the contrary, Budapest was plunged into chaos, with deserting Soviet troops engaging in looting and clashes with security forces. Additionally, local criminals and elements of the Soviet army carried out a series of harrowing excesses, including indiscriminate looting and mass rapes. Although the Soviets often offered protection to children and entire families, maintaining a taboo against harming minors, a significant number of women and girls were victims of brutal rapes. Estimates of the number of victims vary widely, reflecting the complexity and brutality of the situation. It is estimated that the number of women and girls who suffered sexual violence ranges between 5,000 and 200,000, a horrific indication of the human suffering that accompanied the siege of Budapest and its aftermath.